Thank you very much for the opportunity to engage on this topic and to share a little bit of information around what the CSR is doing. And I don't think in sort of 10 minutes I can do justice to what the entire organization is doing. So I'd really like to focus in on sort of two areas, I think, in particular. But just in terms of setting the scene when it comes to the circular economy, it's wonderful to know that we actually have, from a science, technology and innovation perspective, the enabling environment, the policy context for publicly funded research institutions to grapple with this topic of a circular economy. And it was really given effect through the white paper on science, technology and innovation and the new decadal plan of the Department of Science and Innovation that recognizes the circular economy as this cross-cutting growth opportunity for South Africa. And so I think in response to that, it's critical that we understand not only our role within this landscape of what we need to do as research institutions, but really what the circular economy means for us as a developing country. The topic really emerged sort of from the global north and supported by a number of their drivers. And so it's critical for us to understand what is a circular economy within a developing country context. And so I think immediately there's sort of four major areas that stand out for me when it comes to the role of publicly funded institutions. The first one is this one that I've just mentioned now around evidencing the transition to a circular economy. What does it mean for us as South Africa, for Africa, and using data, using science, using evidence to really understand the opportunities and constraints to that. The second major area is around technology. And in many areas, we're probably 20 to 30 years behind the global north when it comes to technology solutions. And so the question then becomes, well, do we have to spend a lot of R&D budget on developing new technologies or reinventing the wheel? Or is there a more important role to play in terms of technology localization, adaptation, where we work with private sector partners, the role to scale and de-risk these particular technologies, and then where niche opportunities exist, the opportunity for new technology development. The third area, I think, is really around policy support, so making sure that we have this right enabling policy environment for the public and private sectors to thrive in a circular economy transition. And then the fourth around human capital development and building the skills that we need in the next generation to support South Africa's transition to a more circular economy. So I'm going to delve into some of these just in a little bit more detail. And I think the first one is really speaking to this point around evidencing South Africa's transition to a more circular economy. And does it make sense for us? And I think we've seen a number of drivers that have emerged globally over the last decade in terms of why countries are really addressing this issue of circularity. The first major one is the issue of resource scarcity. And I heard the question you posed earlier around, critical raw materials. Does South Africa have what it needs? And this was really a major driver for Europe. And we've seen this now spill over into North America, into Asia, as the race is on for the transition to green technologies, alternative energy technologies, 4IR. There's a growing demand for minerals and metals. And what does it mean in terms of resource scarcity when we're dealing with finite resources? We also know that around about 50% of climate impacts come from the extraction and processing of resources. And so, but transitioning to circularity is there an opportunity for climate mitigation. Also, we know the extraction of resources impacts on biodiversity. It impacts upon water in terms of water quality, water stress. And then the third and fourth are sort of more recent ones that we've seen emerge. Largely the discussion we saw during the pandemic in terms of a green economic recovery, build back better. And so it was seen as a way of kind of kickstarting economies post the pandemic, of providing new economic development opportunities, new socio-economic development opportunities and job creation. And so as the CSR, we really wanted to support national government in terms of answering some of these questions. Is resource scarcity a priority for South Africa? Is it our driver? Is climate mitigation, given our climate commitments, is it a driver for South Africa to transition? And so with funding support from the CSR and the Department of Science and Innovation, we addressed this first one. And in fact, the study showed, yes, it is. Surprising to me, I always thought South Africa was a mineral-rich country. We had hundreds of years of resources left in the ground. But the study showed that, in fact, we've got 18 critical or strategic minerals for South Africa, 5 of which have less than 50 years of economically viable mining remaining, assuming that we don't find new major reserves. I think the tragic thing as well is that for many of these critical raw materials, we export them in unbeneficiated form. So it means that we lose direct access to those minerals at end of life. Not only are we not developing the local beneficiation industries in South Africa to take these resources further down the value chain, but once we export them, they are lost to us. And so the question really becomes, what happens when we start to run out of these critical raw materials, and what is the impact on South Africa's economic development, given that mining makes up, I think it's around about 8% of our GDP? What is the impact on our economy when we start to face resource scarcity? But also the study showed that there's also significant opportunity for South Africa, again, as we transition to these alternative energy technologies, to 4IR. There's a growing demand for these minerals and metals. And in fact, just this morning, there was a really excellent webinar by the African Development Bank around how does Africa actually manage its minerals and metals going forward. And do we need to change our view with regards to our relationship with our minerals and metals in terms of local prosperity and local economic development? The second driver that we explored is climate mitigation a driver? And yes, it is. Similar to what global studies have found, it's absolutely a driver for South Africa as well. And implementing circular measures in the energy sector, mobility and agriculture, just the low-hanging fruit, actually provides us with the opportunity to keep greenhouse gas emissions in 2050 to below 2019 values. So it provides almost a stabilization wedge in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And that's very much a conservative estimate, because we found that we just struggled to get data for some of the other circular interventions in terms of the mitigation potential. So definitely still more work that needs to be done in that space. In terms of the economic and socio-economic, those are two areas that we haven't looked at, and possibly there are other science councils, universities, publicly funded research institutions that may be in a better position to answer this question in terms of the development opportunities for the country. But I think it's definitely a major driver for South Africa to understand how we can unlock economic opportunity through these interventions. And so all of this work that the CSR has done to date in terms of understanding the circular economy, what does it mean? What are the opportunities? What are the constraints? We've published those in a series of publicly available reports. The URL is down at the bottom. The mining and the climate one you would have seen on the previous 2 slides. I've spoken to those, but we also delved into agriculture, manufacturing, the cross-cutting economic infrastructure around water, energy, and we still have left to do probably the 2 most complex because of the cross-cutting nature, but also the 2 with the biggest opportunities for circularity, and that is human settlements, our cities and towns, our urban space, and mobility and transportation. How do we drive circularity in those 2? So those reports are all publicly available, and I'm just going to quickly flip through to show you some of the things that we touch on, because it was really important for us in these studies to highlight the fact that the circular economy is not about waste management. It's so much more than that. It's really about sustainable resource management. It's how we as a country use our resources in support of our development objectives. And so in the report, we've actually highlighted circular economy interventions just to stretch the mind in terms of what we're talking about. So we're talking about things like green steel manufacturing, industrial symbiosis, chemical leasing, for example, additive manufacturing. And by engaging with stakeholders from each of the respective sectors, we were able to get a sense of the current levels of implementation of these various interventions, but also the readiness to adopt circular practices. And so you can see the ones with on the screen with the stronger yellower bars was a much lower level of readiness, still kind of new to the South African manufacturing sector, whereas others, if you look at material looping, remanufacturing, renewable energy technologies, already quite a strong footprint within those circular interventions. And we did this for agriculture again as well. So you can see chemical leasing was quite a novel concept to the sector. Agro-processing technologies, on the other hand, was sort of well entrenched, similar to mixed farming. So again, a variety in terms of levels of adoption already when it comes to agricultural practices. When it comes to water, as a water scarce country, we actually have quite a long history, for example, around water reuse within our systems. But again, this growing issue of water scarcity, the modeling that has been done to date would suggest that water demand will exceed supply by 2030, a lot of that going into the agricultural sector. So how do we decouple our agricultural sector? How do we ensure food security, but through reduced water consumption? So again, a lot of opportunity for innovation in that space through greater water efficiency and sufficiency in the agricultural sector. And then similarly in energy, a variety of circular interventions. And energy is a slightly different one in that we had to consider circularity in both the generation of energy, whether it be electricity or transport fuels or things like that, but also in terms of the production of energy technologies. And the previous speaker from Mintech touched on some of these in terms of electronic waste, but are we producing solar panels, for example, in South Africa? Are we importing? If we're importing, are we importing where they are designed for longevity to minimize wastage? Are we importing solar panels that are designed for dismantling, service, resurfacing, repair, remanufacturing, for example, to make sure that we essentially design out waste? So two very strong components around energy there that we need to consider. So that's just some of the work that we've done to date in terms of evidencing this transition for South Africa, very outward focused in support of the DSI and in support of national government to understand what the circular economy is and where the opportunities are that we can really harness, where we already have a strong footprint that we can build on, and where there is space for new work to be done, which is obviously then critical areas for the national system of innovation to play a part in that. But the CSR not only doesn't only undertake research, but we also host a number of initiatives on behalf of national government. One of these is Circular Innovation South Africa, my office, which is aimed at giving effect to many of the aspects of the decadal plan. And so one of the tools that we've put into place within Circular Innovation South Africa is the Circular Economy Demonstration Fund. We launched this in June of this year, and it really stems from that work that the CSR did around evidencing our transition, where we found that the circular economy is not new to South Africa. We've been doing a lot of circular interventions, whether it be in water, energy, manufacturing, agriculture. We've been doing a lot of this already. We just haven't called it the circular economy. But what we also found is that these interventions, most of them, have not achieved the scale yet for meaningful impact. And so the question then became, how do we utilize our national system of innovation to support the private sector in demonstrating, in scaling, in de-risking these interventions to allow for fast-tracking circular economy interventions within their respective sectors. And so we currently are working through that process. We've awarded a number of projects, and I'm really excited to see these kick off in January of next year, where we can really bring our NSI and the private sector closer together to facilitate greater impact and scaling of these circular interventions, because I think it's quite clear from all of the research the CSR has done to date that it absolutely makes sense. It's not a nice to have. The circular economy, I think, is an imperative for every country now as we face greater resource risk, greater resource insecurity, and greater competition for access to resources. And so I think in terms of meeting our development objectives as a country, in terms of the National Development Plan, the circular economy, I think, really is at the heart of that. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much for the opportunity. Thank you.